Hello, puppies and kittens. I am speaking today with Andrew Seidel. He's a constitutional law attorney, VP for strategic comms for Americans United for separation of church and state. He and I have talked a couple of times about the books that he's written about, showing like the founding myth, showing how Christian nationalism is un-American, and now we're dealing with Mike Johnson, our is that his name or is it Bob Smith? I keep getting these.
It is a very generic name that's hard to latch on to.
Yeah. Well, at least a less generic name would have sounded even more insidious. This guy kind of comes in under the radar. He doesn't look like the kind of batshit crazy person that you would expect him to look like. It's been commented that he looks like most of the talking heads on CNN, for example. Most of the Democratic pundits would look like this guy. But then you listen to him speak, and while I will give that he's got a good voice and he is well spoken, everything he says is wrong, and I have a problem with this. So I'm listening to the presentation that he gave at a church. He's giving a bit of a sermon a few years back before he knew where he would ascend. And it's disturbing for me that somebody that was a writer for Answers in Genesis and has many times been to and advocated for the Ark Park, for example, that somebody involved in any way with Answers in Genesis would be in a high position in our government, third in line or second in line to the president.
Yeah. I mean, I'm right there with you. I think that is probably one of the more alarming aspects of his history, which is we're learning more and more about every single day. And I knew I was probably one of the few people in the country who knew who he was before he became speaker. And in fact, we found out about 24 hours, a little more than 24 hours before the vote, that he was a potential candidate for the speakership. And when I heard that, I immediately started telling people on social media who this guy was, because I have tangled with him and the organizations that he has worked for, like Alliance Defending Freedom, like the First Liberty Institute, like Answers in Genesis, many times before. And, he's slated to speak. He and his wife are slated to speak at the Answers in Genesis conference, a women's conference in April. I'd be surprised if he ends up following through with that now that he's speaker, though he may not be by that time. But it is it is truly alarming. You and I have both been to that park. We have seen the disinformation that it targets children at that park.
And the other thing, wait, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Say, it's not just misinformation with the Ark Park. These people know that what they're saying is not true. That's the thing that really bothers me.
Well, and it's publicly funded.
There are a lot of believers who really do believe the nonsense that they're selling, but there are some certain few that I've been able to talk to realize that, yeah, these people know. They know that what they're saying is false, and they're pushing it anyway. And Answers in Genesis with the Ark Park, that these people are doing that, and it's irritating. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's also publicly funded, right? I mean, the Ark was initially set afloat with public money and tax breaks. I mean, this is an organization that I believe discriminated in their hiring too, because it's problematic on a number of fronts. And then, of course, the way that he brings the young earth creationism, anti-evolutionism into his talks and blames things like mass shootings on the fact that we teach evolution in the public schools is deeply problematic.
I'm going to be doing a video rebutting that, because I find all those claims that if there's no God, then how can we be moral? That's such a stupid argument. I mean, if you look at the people that like with the Clergy Project, for example, you look at all these examples. I mean, people are falling away from religion in record numbers, but we are not turning into the werewolf-like criminals that these people make us out to be. If anything, we're doing the reverse. We've stopped being these terrible sodomizing hypocrites and have started evaluating things more ethically. That this is the standard that I commonly see. And so this is going to be something that I'm going to be addressing in an upcoming video. Where I wanted to talk to you, however, is while he goes in this speech that he gives in this church sermon, he does get up to the point where he says, "So where did we go wrong? We turned away from God. We started teaching evolution, and then everybody went mad and started killing everybody." So once he starts telling that lie, I'm going to take that over as a solo project. But when he says, "Where did we go wrong?" he wants to establish first. He tries for the first 20, 25 minutes of his presentation. He's talking as if the United States was a Christian nation. Irritates the hell out of me, because you and I have discussed this. We've studied a hell of a lot about this. I mean, despite or aside from your accolades, I'm on the board of directors for American Atheists. We're all about First Amendment defense, and so we have to know the Constitution as well. So, and the history of the founders, and we know that most secularists, this is one of the problems I have with a lot of believers, they think that secularist means atheist. And so if somebody says, well, this person believed in God, therefore he couldn't be secular, I'm like, no, most secularists believe in God. They just understand that your religious beliefs cannot dictate the law. That the way that I like to put it is, if you cite religion as your sole motivation for any action or policy, then you still have not given a reason for that. There needs to be a secular reason for any action or policy. Your religion can't be the sole one.
I mean, 100%. I could not agree more. When we see this time and time again around the country, more and more lately, where you have public officials deliberately imposing their personal religious beliefs through the rule of law, and that is precisely one of the things that the separation of church and state was meant to prevent. And I mean, let's just be clear here: America invented the separation of church and state. That is an American original. That's ours. The idea was born in the Enlightenment, but it was first implemented in the American experiment. And I think that's something that we can be proud of. I certainly don't think that we should like Johnson bury it under myths about a Christian founding. We did not have a Christian founding. And in fact, it's a good thing we didn't, because the principles that he claims this country was founded on, those principles that are in his Bible that he points to constantly, they're fundamentally opposed to the principles on which this nation was founded. And I'm happy to go into that, but I don't think he does anything to prove his claim.
Yeah, I'm going to want you to go into that, because everything that I've read from the opinions of the founders, which unfortunately are not things that are like necessarily detailed in the public documents, but in the letters to each other, yeah, they're very explicit. When the founders are writing letters to each other, they're explaining their positions very eloquently. Some of that explicit commentary should have been in the founding documents for all to see. Like when Jefferson talks about a wall of separation, when all of the others talk about how bad religion is once it has control over law, look how irrational it is, and look at it, it's always a violation of human rights. That's what always happens when you establish a government based on a religion. And every time, every constitution says, for all these other countries, they all started out saying, that they're dedicated to the Holy Trinity, or whatever. That was the French Constitution at one point. They all, regard the specific religious denomination that they dedicate to right in the opening line, whereas our document, first time ever, doesn't acknowledge any particular deity at all. It makes an ambiguous reference to our Creator. And you may as well just put in the parentheses after that, whatever the fuck that is, right? we leave that up to you. And then it's, because we the people. But Johnson put it very differently. And this is the first comment that I want us to address.
Okay. The Spirit of the Lord has been upon and about and through our nation since the time of its founding. The question is, do we still have that Spirit among us? Because if we don't have the Spirit of the Lord, we do not have freedom. That's not just an admonition for the church, it's for every people, for the city in which we're planted, and for the nation in which we live. And the question is, if we see that Spirit is being quenched, or that the people are turning their face from God, what are we supposed to do about it as the church? I'm often reminded of the words of Jude. Jude, as you know, was a brother of Jesus and James, and he writes a church, not unlike the letter to the church in Corinth, to encourage the church. At the time, there were some false teachings that were making their way into the church, and people were being misled. And so Jude writes his letter, in Jude 3, he says, "Dear friends, although I was very eager to write to you about the salvation we share, Man, that's the good news of the gospel. I wish we could just talk about that all the time, because that's really what it's about, the good news of the gospel.
The good news that an indomitable despot might not mercilessly and violently vindictively torture you forever and ever and ever because you didn't believe improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence. If you didn't believe the right lies, then the God of infinite loving mercy and forgiveness is going to torture you forever and ever and ever, vindictively. And that's the good news, is that maybe if you really, really kiss his ass, his inexplicable insecurity will be such that maybe he won't constantly crush you for all time. Yet, your mind, and you're stuck with him forever. So it's like being in that Twilight Zone episode with little Anthony Fremont. Suddenly God is going to turn and says, "You're thinking bad thoughts," and whiskey in a cornfield or something. This is the Christian heaven.
Well, I think it's also a good time to mention too, any politician, including Johnson here, any politician's personal religious beliefs kind of don't matter or shouldn't matter, right? And they're certainly free to believe that if they want. The problem that I mean, I do have personal problems with some of these beliefs, but the real problem is that Johnson, as a big proponent of Christian nationalism, is dragging those beliefs into the government. He's using his official government power to impose those beliefs on everybody else in the country. That's why he ran for public office in the first place. So he's taking all of these beliefs that he is free to have, but he's using the machinery of the state to impose them on everybody else. And that is a huge problem.
What is the root problem in America? Where did we get off track? Now listen, we have to remember, as bad as it is right now, it didn't begin this way. Let me see the next slide, if you will. And I want to take you back, just a quick review of our history so we can remember where we came from, remember our foundations, our origins, and then try to discern and figure out where we got off track. Because we can figure that out, we'll know again how to seek the peace and prosperity, okay? So just a little reminder, and many of you will know this well, but you'll recognize this language. It comes straight out of our nation's birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence. Now, you know that when we began as a nation, it was an incredible moment in human history. It was a very revolutionary idea that we were founded upon.
There's one thing that I agree with Johnson about, is when he says that it's a revolutionary idea that the United States was founded upon. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Where the idea is that it's a meritocracy, where religion does not matter, because that is the thing that mattered everywhere prior to the foundation of this country, and to the formation of this country. That was also a huge issue there. I know that the founders referred to things like the Salem witch trials and the state constitutions in the formation, and they were realizing how the Quakers were turning against the Puritans, or the other way around, and the way the Valladolid debate between the Catholics, trying to literally dehumanize Native Americans. And all of the atrocities that were going on under the name of religion, both in the New World and in the Old World, with the Huguenots and the Protestants and Catholics, like at war with each other everywhere, and then to say nothing of what they were calling at the time the Mussulman, or the Muslims, and their never-ending conflict. And so there's just nothing but religious angst, where everybody's turning against each other over their religious beliefs. So as long as you don't require and don't acknowledge any specific religion or doctrine, and it doesn't matter what, you could have an assembly, you could have a Congress of people from all these different religions, and we don't have to know what your religion is, because it literally doesn't matter to our government. That is novel. That's unique. That's something nobody ever did before. So if you are from India and your caste system has put you forever in this absurd position of being prejudiced against by every other caste in your community, well, those castes don't exist here. None of that matters here. So it doesn't matter what you do or don't believe. It's what is your humanity? What is your merit? What is your capability, your talents, and so forth? That's what made the United States. That's what gave the United States the ability to become great. Not that we necessarily ever did it, but it was a great idea.
I mean, a lot of our founding maxims are aspirational, including "we the people." We've not yet lived up to "we the people" being all of the people. We're still struggling with that today. We will get there by fighting against people like Mike Johnson and his Christian nationalist tendencies, right?
In fact, some historians have said that, America is the only nation in the world that is founded upon a creed. It's like a statement of faith. G.K. Chesterton said that one time. He was a famous British philosopher and author. He said, and that creed is stated with theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. In other words, with clarity, it's this very idea. Now the language is familiar, but I want us to think about what this means. Now, Jefferson writes the language of the Declaration. He works in a small committee with Adams and Franklin and a couple others. I believe that he was divinely inspired to write the words that he did, and it begins this way. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, what is a self-evident truth? It's something that we cannot not know. Why is that? Because our Creator stamps it into our heart, on our minds, right? We're made in His image, and so there are certain things you cannot not know.
Everything that guy just says is bullshit.
And that all men are created equal. Now remember, they're not born equal, they are created equal. Now, what does that imply? A creator with a capital C.
So let me say two things about that. And the first is that the Declaration of Independence is not the Constitution. The Constitution is the governing document of the United States. The Declaration of Independence was a letter to a candid world explaining why a country was declaring independence, was severing its political ties from Great Britain. It is a document of destruction, not of creation. And if you look at the Constitution, you don't get any of that language. Our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from the people, not God's. Right? That's the "we the people" at the beginning. Those words are poetic, but there's so much more. Our Constitution was the first governing document not to mention a god or deity. And it's godless by choice, not by accident. Some of the people in the founding generation objected to that choice. Our Constitution was the first to ban religious tests for public office. And that was the only mention of religion in the original unamended document. And that includes some of the most clear and emphatic language in the entire document, and a document that's often deliberately vague. It says no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust, right? Like no shall ever any. So there's a lot that's wrong with our Constitution, but the secular foundations are what made it unique. And our genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to humanity. And it's convenient that Johnson just doesn't point to our governing document, but instead latches on to the Declaration of Independence as a way to go ahead and try to say, well, we really, this is, he often calls it the birth certificate if you go back and read that. And then they focus on this passing mention. And there's so much to talk about here. And I do all of this in the founding myth if people want to dive deeper. So there are two major principles that you
highly recommend that book, by the way. If you haven't read it, it's extremely good.
Thank you.
So
there are two major principles in the Declaration of Independence. The first is that power comes from the people, which we see transferred into the Constitution, "we the people," and that people have a right to rebel against tyrannical rule. That those two principles are the bedrock of the Declaration of Independence, and both of them are contradicted in the Bible and by Johnson. And again, I go over each of these at length, but later on, or if you go look at his speech, his acceptance speech on the speakership, he talks about how all rulers are lifted up by God and put into those positions, right? That is fundamentally opposed to "we the people," to the idea that power comes from the people and that the people are the ones who elect the rulers. And when you pair that belief with his election denialism, it kind of has a little bit of more haunting quality to it.
It's also a little confusing that he professes that according to his scriptures, according to what Jesus said, that all these people that are in positions of political power were placed there by God. That means Biden was put in his position by God.
Yep. But he denies it when it's not his party. It's fascinating.
And that they're endowed by that Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
I have a question for you. I mean, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, it would seem to me, I've always identified as being on the left. The reason that I do is not because of well, it is because I took a battery of tests, different unrelated political tests, to make sure that that is actually my political alignment. So when you I took a half a dozen different sets of tests that all put me in exactly the same place, in the anti-authoritarian left quadrant of the political compass, and largely because I advocate for human rights over endeavors for corporate profits that would minimize or restrict or inhibit human rights. And it seems to me that those who are on the right will roll over human rights, or they would have preferential treatment. Only certain people have rights, and the rest do not. So there's no equality there.
But yeah, I mean, that's the goal of Christian nationalism. The goal of Christian nationalism is to make it so that conservative, white, heterosexual Christian men are a favored class, which the law protects, but the law doesn't bind. And everybody else is bound by the law, but not protected by it.
So how do you have a pursuit of rights when you're not allowed to use the same water fountain, or when you don't have control over your own body's reproductive abilities, or any number of things that the Christian conservatives want to put all these impositions on? I've heard people saying that, like, atheists and homosexuals should be, and I think it was John Hagee in San Antonio who said this, one of the hate preachers in a megachurch, who said that atheists and homosexuals should be locked away in internment camps until we go extinct.
Wow. I mean, that's more to the point of Mike Johnson's history. He has spent a lifetime trying to outlaw being gay. Not just deny them equal rights, but to effectively outlaw it, to make it so that they can't have intimate relationships or marriages with each other. And he spent his career trying to deny that in the name of his God. So to get to his content a little bit more, first of all, he's again pointing to the Declaration of Independence, when the preamble of the Constitution offers some pretty compelling language as well. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, right? Those are 6 pretty cool, broad, good things that we could say our Constitution tries to do, that are a little bit, maybe they don't have the same rhetorical flair that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness do, but they encompass a lot of it.
This concept was so revolutionary. Why was it? Because remember, at the time that this began, 1776, right? Prior to this, virtually every people group in the world regarded what they called the divine right of kings. What was the divine right of kings? Well, they believed that the king is the sovereign, and the king will then give to you, all of the subjects. He would tell you what your rights are, what you can believe, property you can own, where you can go, what you can say, how you can live, and all the rest. Because you were subjects to the king. The king had the divine right, and you were just his subjects. Now, the founders came along and they said, that's not correct. Why? Because they studied Locke and Blackstone, and they read the Word of God. And they said, wait a minute now. There's a creator who hovers above the affairs of men. He's up here. He is transcendent above the affairs of men. All men are just down here on this level. We're all mortals. God is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. He's all things. He's everything.
Which the founders never said.
Yeah, that is divine right of kings.
Yeah, but that wasn't something that the founders of the United States. The founders of the United States were not advocating that God was above people. We were saying the power comes from the people, not from the God.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
And God gives us our rights. Well, that means we don't get our rights from the government, from the state, from a tyrant, from a king. We get our rights from our Creator himself.
Did God give black people slaves at that time? Did he give them the right to be 3/5 of a person? Did he give women the right to vote when we established this country? Has God given the right to Arabic women to drive? Or has it been? Did God give the British people, and through the 1950s and so on. Did he give homosexuals in Britain? Were they were criminals? They didn't have a right to be, literally. They didn't have a right to exist. Or has it been that in reality, every right anybody ever had came from legislators and not from magic imaginary deities?
Yeah, I mean, it is up to us to defend each other's rights and to expand those rights to our fellow human beings, right? And in most of those cases, that's the flaw with the argument that I make about human rights, premised on the fact of being a human. Because for a long stretch of human history, humans did not view each other equally. There were groups that were viewed as lesser, and based on sex, based on race, wrongly based on sex, wrongly based on race. We know that to be wrong now, and we can move away from that. But this is one of the reasons that you see in the lead up to genocide. You often see dehumanizing language employed about the victims of that by the perpetrators of that genocide. It's why you see things like being called cockroaches and rats. I mean, this is a common thread in genocidal language. It's really horrifying aspect. I took actually. I studied international human rights law at the University of Amsterdam for a year, and we spent a whole semester on studying genocide and what happens in the run-ups to this, and then how you can use international law to stop it, or at least try to get some justice after the fact. And this is where my view of human rights really comes from, and it's why it's so important that we recognize the humanity of our brothers and sisters and siblings, whatever form that may take, and treat them as all humans deserving and worthy of those rights, and speak out against any attempt to suggest that somebody is lesser in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of a god even.
So again, what I see between the left and the right, which is an oversimplification, I do not see it as left or right. I know that there's other nuance, there's a spectrum of color going on here, but in the simplest terms, just seeing left and right, I often see the comparison of people on the right saying, well, what about my special privilege? Or what about my rights? Mm-hmm. And then people on the left are saying, well, what about their rights? And that seems to be the difference. That the people in the conservatives, for example, do not care about gay rights until they realize their son is gay. It's like if it doesn't personally affect them, they could give a shit less. Whereas I remember somebody saying that it was selling a button that said "I'm straight but not narrow," so that what it meant was you didn't have to be gay in order to advocate for gay rights, because back in the 80s, if you were advocating for gay rights, it meant you were gay.
Yeah.
Right. So I get that. I can advocate for somebody else's situation even if I can't relate to it, which is something that the GOP doesn't understand. Why are you saying that I got into this argument yesterday? Why are you saying that Muslims deserve equal rights, or that they get freedom of religion too? Like, because Islam is a religion. I don't have to agree with it. I argue that Christians, you have a right to believe all the stupid horse shit that you believe. You do. And so do they. And so does everybody else. And but I've had Christian conservatives, Christian nationalists particularly, tell me and state in public documents that freedom of religion means you have the freedom to worship Jesus however we want you to.
That it goes back to the goal of Christian nationalism, right? The goal of Christian nationalism is to create two different classes of people, so that conservative white Christian men are favored and everybody else is a disfavored second-class citizen at best. It really is. I think you're hitting the central goal of Christian nationalism. For them, it's not a bug; it's a feature.
If there ever comes a time when the king or the highest human authority begins to take away the rights that God himself gives to us, then we are justified to stand up and appeal to our Creator, to stand for those rights. That was the idea that animated the American Revolution. It started us off. We were the first group of people in the world who made that assertion.
What Johnson is really talking about, and this is the part that's scary to me, is he is talking about God-given rights. And this is just something that you hear from Christian nationalists all the time. And I think it's truly scary because history has shown us that what is given by a God can be taken away by those who speak with or for that God. Right? Slavery was God's will until it wasn't. Segregation and anti-miscegenation laws that you were just talking about were meant to keep the races separate as God intended. The opposition to same-sex marriage was largely based in religion, right? God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. We've all heard it. Progress in many important areas of human rights has long been opposed by those claiming to know God's mind and execute God's will. Now, it's true, religion did help in some of those causes, but the opposing justifications were nearly always situated in divine law. And this to me is the important part. Human rights are universal and absolute. They're not susceptible to religious whim and fancy simply by virtue of being human. Just because you were born, you have certain inherent inalienable rights. God-given rights, what they are espousing, depend on geography, right? Do you live in Indiana or India or Iran? They depend on those who claim to know God's will. Do you think your leader, or do your leaders think like Muhammad's or Martin Luther's or Martin Luther King Jr.'s interpretation of God's will is correct? God-given rights are so problematic because they depend solely on a particular individual's interpretation of his God's word. Now, perhaps that interpreter adheres to some higher authority, right? Like maybe he follows the Pope or an author of the Bible. But at the end of that line of spiritual authority, a human being is claiming to know God's will. One person's belief is suddenly given the weight of divine law. A fallible human being is claiming divine sanction. And that, my friend, is moral relativism, masquerading as moral absolutism. It is far better that we premise human rights on the simple fact of being human than to put them in the hands of one person claiming to speak for a supernatural being that may or may not exist.
Let me show you some other words in the next slide, if you will. Now, this is also language straight out of the Declaration of Independence, our nation's birth certificate. It says we do all this in accordance with the laws of nature and of nature's God, and with a firm reliance upon the protection of divine providence. Now, what is the laws of nature? What's the natural law?
So there's four references that Christian nationalists love to trot out to try to prove that the Declaration of Independence is a Christian document. Laws of nature and of nature's God, their creator, divine judge, and supreme ruler. There are a number of there are a bunch of ways I can go into all those. And if you want to do that, go read the Founding Myth. The interesting thing is that none of them are explicitly Christian, including their creator, which is there is kind of important. It's not the creator, it's their creator. None of them is explicitly Christian, and only one was original to the draft that Jefferson wrote of the Declaration. So that the other three don't have much of a function. We might call them rhetorical window dressing. The only reference that Jefferson included when he was drafting the documents, which the document relies on the principles of, is the laws of nature and of nature's God, right? That invokes natural law, not the Judeo-Christian God. And this is, natural law is, there's kind of two views of it. One is founded on universal human nature and the other on sort of divine justice. And we know for a fact that Jefferson was a proponent of the former. Christian natural law, which is what Mike Johnson is proposing here, was anathema to Thomas Jefferson. And we have this in his writings, for instance, his opinion on the French treaties from 1793, a summary view of the rights of British America from 1774. We know that Jefferson didn't agree with Mike Johnson's interpretation here. Of course, their creator, that language is not specifically Christian, right? The Judeo-Christian God, whatever that might mean, is described as a creator in the Bible, in Genesis, but every religion that describes a creator God, and deism is defined by that belief in that cosmic creator God, right? Like that's not really unique or original. And so scholars could argue about whether that reference is deistic or theistic, but what we can be sure about is that it's not a Christian reference, right?
Yeah.
Like they could have said the Christian God or the God of the Bible, which is what Mike Johnson does. They didn't do that. They said their creator. And by the way,
and they specified nature's God.
And well, yeah, I mean, that's the one
Which
reference
is
that Jefferson
deistic.
did leave in, the laws of nature and of nature's God. And there was, interestingly, a reference to Christianity in the original Declaration of Independence. Do you know what it was for?
No.
So Jefferson condemned the, quote, Christian king of Great Britain, and he put Christian in all caps and underlined it. The Christian king of Great Britain for engaging in the slave trade. And the founders took that out of the rough draft. So that was the only mention of Christianity in the original Declaration.
I can see that. Much as I would love to have seen that criticism still in there for Jefferson.
Yeah, interesting,
to
right?
have said that, yeah, that's a little hypocritical.
You can, and if people are interested, the Library of Congress does have they have an exhibit on the Declaration, and you can see the rough draft with that. And I included a screenshot. I included a photo of it in the founding myth too. So,
well, the founders believed in two concepts of revelation. They believed in the idea of general revelation, which we get by observing God's creation, God's nature. You know, the Apostle Paul says in the Scripture that men are without excuse. Why does Paul say that? Because, well, for example, we woke up this morning, we saw the sunrise. I know innately that I don't have the ability to make that, nor does my neighbor. And so we know intuitively, because God, these are the things that God stamps into our heart, we know that there is a higher power. That's the natural law, God's unalterable laws of the universe that he himself created.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
So we have the general revelation that we see by observing nature. We also, however, have something very more specific than that, called the special revelation. Now, what is the special revelation that men have? Well, that is what we find in the Word of God. See, because our Creator was so benevolent that he gave us an owner's manual, an instruction manual for how to order this thing called life. We're very complex operations, aren't we? And so he's so good, he gave us the manual.
Have you noticed that the Bible, this owner's manual, doesn't tell us anything we should know? Like, you know, what diseases are caused by microbes or anything. I mean, it tells us that we should wash our hands, right? And it tells us we should, like, not touch dead bodies and things like that. I mean, the obvious things. But then Jesus comes along and contradicts that, saying that it doesn't matter. You don't have to wash your hands because it's not what you put into your mouth. It's only what comes out of your mouth, because Jesus apparently believed in magic words. So we have this contradiction. He thought that diseases were caused by demons rather than pathogens or poisons or whatever. So we don't have an owner's manual. We have something that implies that the world is flat, that it's on foundations, that the sun and the moon are the same size, that they're both bigger than the stars, that the sun is not a star, that they sit in the firmament, that the firmament is a solid piece of mirrored glass over the dome of the sky around the flat disc-shaped earth. The Bible says nothing accurate or correct or true about our history. All it does is feed into racism, sexism, and genocide.
And when it comes to government, which I think is where Johnson is going with this, the only governments in the Bible are monarchies, theocratic monarchies at that. There is no whiff of representative government anywhere in the Bible. And that is why when the founding fathers were writing the Constitution, and in the Constitutional Convention behind those closed doors of Independence Hall in Philadelphia during those hot summer months in 1787, they did not quote or cite the Bible almost at all. And the few times that you get like an allusion to the Bible, it's more for like storytelling purposes, not to point to and be like, hey, the Bible says we should do this, or hey, that's a principle in the Bible, let's go ahead and import that into our government. They just didn't do it at all. We have the records. We know they didn't do it. So if you think we have an instruction manual, we also have documentation that instruction manual was not imported into our government in any way, shape, or form. We have the text of our governmental charters, which say we're not going to do that.
So two important points here is that, one, if we had founded the United States, currently, if it hadn't been in the 1700s, if we've done it now, if we were forming a country now, that we would make all of these cultural references would more likely be to the Marvel Comics universe. We would more often talk about Thanos.
I'm laughing because I give a talk on how the Supreme Court's weaponizing religious freedom right now, and I bring in Thanos and Voldemort and Sauron from Lord of the Rings. So I'm really laughing as you're saying that. Yep,
because we know these stories. We know what the stories mean. It doesn't mean that the stories are true.
Absolutely.
And so we in the special revelation of God, we learn about our need for a Savior. We learn that we're sinners, and we learn all the other specifics about their faith. And so the founders looked at that. They acknowledged the general revelation, the special revelation. They formulated this all together, and they said, you know what? If we're going to launch a new country, we're going to break away from Great Britain. We're going to in effect have a clean slate upon which to create a new system of government, a new set of civil laws. You know what? We better create our laws in accordance with the laws of nature. In other words, we better follow the instruction manual, or it's going to be folly. It's going to lead us into chaos and anarchy, because God told us what the rules are. We order ourselves accordingly, individually and collectively.
I mean, this is the central question I ask in the founding myth. I ask, did Christian principles or Judeo-Christian principles, whatever that might mean, positively influence the founding of the United States? And the answer is no, they didn't. America was not founded on Christian principles. And Johnson here really has the burden of proof. He is making a claim that is rejected by most scholars. He has to show two things to really prove this. One, he has to show that some principle exists that positively influenced the founding of the United States. So it's got to be a principle that's unique and original to Christianity that positively influenced the founding. And not only can he not meet those standards, I actually disprove them in the founding myth. And I could do the thing, I could talk about the godless Constitution, our secular government, the rejection of prayer and religion at the Constitutional Convention. I could talk about how all the states mimicked the secular government when they saw how well it worked, or the Treaty of Tripoli, which says that the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. But I don't need to do that, because the Christian principles that Johnson is talking about conflict with American principles. And a good example is the Ten Commandments. Right? The Ten Commandments begin. Go ahead.
I have a T-shirt that says the first commandment contradicts the First Amendment.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. It would be hard to write a rule that is more at odds with our First Amendment, with the American commitment to freedom of worship. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Again, violates the First Amendment. Religious liberty, free speech, free expression. Most monuments to the Ten Commandments, by the way, stop there. The monuments that you see dotted around to the Ten Commandments are edited versions of the Ten Commandments. We use our own modern morality to cut out the immoral parts of the Ten Commandments, including the two mentions of slavery and the last part of this commandment, which says, it continues, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of the parents to the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. Right? So if you're following along at home, that is God's most moral law, promising to deliberately punish innocent children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren for the heinous crime of exercising their freedom of religion.
Now, wasn't there, I remember talking to a historian when I was giving testimony to the Texas State Board of Education, because they were determined to teach American exceptionalism, even if they knew that it wasn't true, because they said that it was important that students believe in it. Even if they have to lie to make the students believe in that, they're going to teach that. But one of the historians that was there to testify told me that there was one of the founding fathers had made a statement explicitly stating that the United States was not based on the Ten Commandments, which, all these people want to say that our entire judicial system is based on a covenant between God and Moses. That's the way it was phrased in the Texas Board of Education. And I don't remember which of the founders it was who said that, no, we're not based on any law that's related to Moses.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few that sort of glance off that come to mind, and I do have a couple of them in the founding myth. But I mean, and it's, I love finding quotes like that, but really the overall issue is that the comparison between those Christian principles and the American constitutional system continues like that, right? The Bible venerates principles like obedience and fear. The Constitution venerates freedom. The Bible teaches you to obey rulers because they are ordained by God, right? That's something that Johnson has said and will continue to say. But in the United States, we the people give their rulers the power, and we the people retain not just the right, but also a duty to rebel against totalitarian rulers. Biblical justice is so severe and vicious that it would, if it were implemented, violate the Constitution. Hell, which is a central tenet of Christianity, conflicts with the Constitution on at least two major counts: a place of torture and as a place of eternal punishment. Original sin, another essential Christian principle, at least for some sects of Christianity, violates the presumption of innocence, which is a core value in American justice system. And vicarious redemption, which is probably the defining Christian principle, repudiates personal responsibility upon which, like, all of American law and society and government rest. So I don't think we have to debunk every errant quote or historical tidbit, because the foundational claim that Johnson is making, that Christian principles influenced America's founding principles, has to be discarded because they conflict with America's founding principles.
Let me see the next slide. Now, I just want to show you what some of the founders said about this in their own words. We know what the documents say because we've studied those, sometimes on our own. We don't do it in school much anymore. But President John Quincy Adams, on July 4th, 1821, this is our nation's birthday, he says, "The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity." What an idea.
Well, I mean, we just went over that, but I'll add that John Quincy Adams was not a founding father. He was the son of a founding father. He was a kid when a lot of this was going on. Super talented and interesting guy. Really fascinating, and highly recommend if people have not read it. Harlow Giles Unger wrote a really fascinating biography of John Quincy Adams, who is like so much cooler than most people realize, but not a founding father. And as we just explained, that is an inaccurate statement. And it's also just, well, it's slightly different because the founders often don't mean, when they say things like Christian principles or Christian religion, they often don't mean Christianity as we think of it today. They often mean what Thomas Jefferson meant, which is the moral philosophy of the character Jesus Christ from the Christian Bible, divorced from all of the supernatural aspects of that. So there's this quote that John Adams, so John Quincy Adams' father, has, where he talks about the Christian religion, and I don't remember it exactly off the top of my head, divorced from the roguery of monkish priests, something like that. And so what he's really saying there is he's really talking about the moral philosophy of the character of Jesus, divorced from everything that Christianity itself built up around it. And that's why Thomas Jefferson goes through the Bible and cuts out everything that is supernatural from the virgin birth to the resurrection, and discards it.
When you're talking about Christian principles from the perspective of somebody from the 18th century, it's going to be dramatically different from the idea of Christian principles in the 21st century, which again is dramatically different from the Christian principles of the 3rd or 4th century, because those principles have changed dramatically each time. And what we commonly see as Christian values today, I've noticed that every one of these values is a prejudice against other people.
Yeah. You're often the case.
Now, a constitutional republic is still an experiment on the world stage. I hope you're aware of that. July 4th of this year, we celebrated our 240th anniversary. That's great. 240th birthday as a nation. It seems like a long time. But if you think about it over the span of human history, that's not a long time at all. And we don't know how long this form of government can last. We really don't. Now, they certainly didn't know it in 1776. In the 18th century, they didn't know how long this was going to last. They believed that they were divinely inspired. They wrote about it to set it up this way, based upon biblical principles, but they didn't know how long it could endure.
What is a
Well,
biblical principle? Does that just mean blindly believing whatever a certain set of clergymen tell you?
yeah, I mean, he got half of it right, right? Like, they didn't know how long it would endure is true, but the first half is just not true. I mean, again, we have the records from when the founders were drafting the Constitution. And you can't read those records and make that argument with a straight face. It just cannot be done. This man
But
is not a constitutional scholar. This man is a Christian
but
nationalist.
you're a constitutional law attorney. You've specialized this. I mean,
Yeah.
but for what I've heard consistently, one of the Christian values is that they know more than the experts, and you're an expert. That means you don't know as much as the willfully ignorant,
Yeah.
because
Well,
professing to be fools or professing to be wise, they became fools. So wisdom is foolish, and only the fools are wise. This is the argument that we constantly get from Christians.
yeah, I mean, it reminds me of 1984. The party told you not to believe the evidence of your own eyes. I mean, it genuinely, it's like I have read every one of the diaries, the letters, everything from the time of the Constitutional Convention. We have it all. Max Ferrand put together these amazing 3 volumes on it. I've read them through twice at least, plus countless dives into them for research purposes. That argument just holds zero water if you spend any time in those records. I mean, for instance, there was this moment at the Constitutional Convention when they're sort of deadlocked, and Ben Franklin proposes a prayer. And this is just like a favorite fact of Christian nationalists, that Ben Franklin proposed the prayer, and we have the language of it, and they love to talk about it. Even a bird can't fall without him noticing. There's some really interesting. I mean, Ben Franklin was not something of an irreligious man, something of irreverent, maybe is the better word for it. And this guy, I've seen people argue that he proposed it as kind of a, hey, let's all get through this together. There's also an apocryphal quote of Hamilton's, which is likely not true, where he says we don't need foreign aid in getting through this, and rejects it. But the Constitutional Convention, this is one of the few mentions of religion at all during the convention, rejects the prayer. They don't want to do it. And Franklin writes on his manuscript, the convention, except for 3 or 4 persons, found prayer unnecessary. Right? Like, they don't want to do it. They've got better things to do with their time. Come on, man. Focus.
So the founders in the early days rejected prayer as unnecessary. Yeah. But now our current Congress suddenly has to have prayer. And if you give prayer and you're not a Protestant Christian, then you're going to have people in Congress booing you or trying to disrupt from your prayer.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about that a lot in the Founding Myth. And one of the interesting things about the Constitutional Convention is it did occur behind closed doors, and the framers, the delegates, swore an oath of secrecy. So they engaged in something called strategic piety, where they would put on a public religious face from time to time, especially in the lead up to the Declaration of Independence. For instance, when the Continental Congress met in 1774, they hired this guy named Jacob Duché as chaplain to say a prayer. And Duché gives this prayer and then later becomes a traitor. I actually wrote a piece for Religion Dispatches because Duché is the first person to give a government prayer really in the nascent country. And the Supreme Court has pointed to his prayer to uphold the prayers that you were just talking about that happened before the legislature nowadays. And Duché was a traitor. He an absolute traitor. So I wrote an article called "The Traitor Who Gave America Prayer." But yeah, I mean, again, this is it. You can't be somebody who understands history and what was happening at that time and make the claims that Johnson is making. It just those two. Well,
there's a lot of these words mean something different from the 18th century to now. I mean, now what we would have called a traitor back then is the party's leading nominee.
Now, how do you keep a republic? Well, the founders had a lot to say about this. George Washington, let me see the next slide. George Washington was the father of our country. You know, he was our great general, the first president. He was, I believe, he truly was divinely created for the task that the Lord laid before him. A great leader. And he famously gave his farewell address. He's leaving his storied public life you know, our countrymen at the time wanted to make Washington the king. It was like their knee-jerk reaction. Oh, he's so good. He's such a great leader. Let's make him the king. And he says, no, we're reminding you, we don't do that. We've created a republic. This is a different form of government, not the divine right of kings anymore. This is a government of the people, by the people, we the people, right? And he says in his farewell address, he says, listen to me, listen. This is my admonition to you, my fellow countrymen, and it echoes down through the generations to you and me. He says, of all the dispositions and habits, how do you keep a republic? Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are the indispensable supports. How do you seek the peace and prosperity of the city in which you're planted? You remember those foundations and you allow them to flourish, right? So Washington said this. Now, they use lofty language, the founders, but oftentimes we're speaking to high school and college groups and we break it down kind of their level. And I say, look, Washington was basically saying, look, we're building a kind of like a proverbial house. Let's call it a house. And so we're building this house, and it's an experiment. We don't know how long the house is going to stand, but we can tell you it's not built on sand. It's built on two very firm foundations. They are religion and morality. And if there ever comes a time in this country when the foundations are whittled away or eroded, the entire proverbial house is subject to fall. Now, our second president is John Adams, and go to the next one, and he says it a little differently. He says, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Why? Now, he went on. Now, listen to his next words. He says, because we have no government armed with power capable enough of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. You see any unbridled passions in the culture right now? Absolutely. And the founders warned us that that the republic could not survive without it.
What Washington and Adams are saying here is they're talking about morality and religion, but they're not specifying what the religion is. I mean, I joined the Satanic Temple. I could arguably say that my religion now is Satanism. And one of the things that I like about that religion is, you know, contrary to a lot of the stereotypes against the left, is that Satanism advocates for forgiveness. That it rather than canceling people. Mm-hmm. That if you can show that you're aware that a mistake has made and you would like to make make amends to that, we'll work with you on that, and that this is how you earn forgiveness. Okay, so what religion are they talking about? They're not specifying here. We know that they were not overtly Christian, either of them. Yeah. Right.
So this is really fascinating, because one thing, here's something I think that Johnson doesn't realize when he tries to use these quotes to make the Christian nation argument. They completely undermine his argument. And this is crucial because this is one of the more popular arguments that Christian nationalists makes. They will trot out these two quotes, but it's a really bad argument for their side. But it's so crucial, and it's kind of hard for us to follow and rebut, that I devote a whole chapter in the founding myth to this. So we often see Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin speaking and writing of religion and morality. Okay. And that's the way they always phrase it, religion and morality, because they did not think that religion was the source of morality, but a substitute for it. They wrote of religion and morality as two distinct things. They were, in effect, claiming that religion is necessary for a society to function. Otherwise, the lower classes are going to steal and rape and murder. Okay, so two things here. First, they were wrong, right? Every measure of societal health and well-being that we know of, from violent crime to corruption to intolerance to poverty, it is the least religious countries that do better. It is the least religious states that do better. Second, and this is critical, they were claiming morality for the founders, religion for the masses. Okay, the founders didn't need religion, the masses did. The founders had morality, the masses needed religion. So it was the educated elite, the founders, they achieved morality independent of religion with thought and reason and reading and by consulting their libraries, but not the masses. They needed mandates and rules and a simple list of things to follow, maybe like a list of 10. Right? So if the founders believed that religion and morality were distinct, which they definitely did, and that the plebes needed religion to stay in line, and they did believe that, that also means that the founders did not need religion. It means that the founders were moral without religion. It means that morality, not religion, was their guiding principle. So this ends the debate. because it means that the founders built a government using their own morality, their own principles derived from thought and reason, what we might call Enlightenment principles, and not religion. This admits, by trotting out these quotes, Johnson is admitting that the founders did not use religious principles to craft this nation. And to your point, notice also that the founders didn't view religion as valuable because of its truth claims or because it was the source of morality, but simply as a means of producing good behavior without a reasoned moral analysis. So Johnson is shooting himself in the foot at best when he is trotting out these quotes. He just doesn't realize it.
That reminds me of Martin Luther King, who made the statement that the United States was set up with socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor.
Yeah.
Kind of the same philosophy going on here.
Yeah.
Dr. Benjamin Rush was another founder. Let me see the next one. And he was a signer of the Declaration, a father of our first public schools, a treasurer of the U.S. Mint. He knew a little bit about the original intent of the country. And he said the only foundation for a republic is to be laid in religion. Why? Because without that, without religion, there can be no virtue. And without virtue, there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object and life of all Republican governments. In other words, if you didn't have virtue as the underlying foundation of this experiment of a republic, the republic is not going to last. It's going to lead into chaos and anarchy, and that's kind of where we're headed right now, as you know.
I would argue that, yeah, he's correct. And we've seen that the Republican Party has no virtue, and that's why we're headed into anarchy right now, where we have somebody who was a traitor, who is guilty of infidelity on all of his marriages and all of his promises. I mean, a habitual liar. This is their primary candidate. This is their nominee, right? This is somebody who literally tried to overturn the country and is still trying to do that, and will do that if he gets elected. So we're headed into anarchy largely because the Republican Party has no virtue. Whereas when I was born in 1962, if I was an adult in 1962, I would then have been a proud Republican, because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had very different positions back then. The Democratic Party in 1962 was the party of the Ku Klux Klan. It was the party that was associated with the Ku Klux Klan. But as a part of the Southern strategy, the Democrats and the Republicans have largely switched policies. Johnson even admits that if you go back a couple of decades, if you were to read the Republican Party platform and the Democratic Party platform, at least the National Party platforms, they were very similar. There one or two subtleties, and I noticed that myself. In 2001, there's hardly a difference between them. But 20 years on, there's a distinct difference. And they started from opposite ends. They crossed each other in the 1960s, and now they're on very opposite ends, so that everybody that was, all the Klansmen in the 60s that were Democrats, those that are still alive are all Republicans now. And so this is how they've swapped positions. And we now see Mitt Romney and a number of other Republicans. There's like a half a dozen of them that have been in the news recently as simply dropping out of Congress or bowing out of their party. And there's several of them that just say that this is the Republican Party of today is not the party that we once belonged to. This is not the party of Lincoln. This is not even a party that Lincoln would recognize. They've all become madmen. They're Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ted Cruz and a list of idiots that they don't want to be associated with. This is a problem.
Yeah, I think everything. It's the issue of virtue, right? Like his idea of virtue is, I think, probably not divorced from the Bible and his religion, whereas our view of virtue is doing necessarily good and not harming to other people. Yeah, so I think it's like, yeah, we agree, except like when you pull back or open that particular door behind that.
I've often said that if you use the Bible as your exclusive moral guide, then you would be a criminal in every country on the planet.
Yeah. I think that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Let me see the next slide, and I just want to show you that Alexis de Tocqueville was a famous French historian, philosopher, and he was kind of like an investigative journalist in the early 1830s. 1831 to 1835, he travels the American countryside, and his task is to try to figure out what is the secret to America's genius and power. Because here's this new nation that's arising out of nothing, out of the dust, and becoming the first superpower in the world, effectively. And so he travels around, he talks to everybody all throughout the country, he takes all these notes, he travels with the companions, they do this exhaustive study, and he publishes what we refer to, it's called the 2-volume work, Democracy in America. It's still the leading treatise on American exceptionalism. And he famously concludes this in the book. He says, we had hypothesized, we had thought that we would discover the secret to America's genius and power in her vast marketplaces, in her matchless constitution, in her Congress that's set up in such an amazing way, and in her fertile fields and her ample harbors and all the rest. And he says, but that's not where we found it. Now listen to what he concluded. He said, it was not until we went into the churches of America and we heard her pulpits flame with righteousness did we understand the secret to her genius and power. He said, America is great because she is good, and if she ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great.
If you're already inclined to revere churches, as you think that's obviously for mistaken reasons, if you think that churches are a source of good, which they've proven since then not to be, then of course you're going to have this bias to say this thing, which I think is just going to be quote mined. Because when I was a kid, I remember you would look upon a Catholic priest, as you would see the collar and everything, you would recognize, oh, well, there's a good and kindly, moral, upstanding man you can trust. But that opinion has changed dramatically over the last 30, 40 years, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. And, I think he's going for an Alexis de Tocqueville quote here. I didn't have a chance to dive into it before our talk, but Alexis de Tocqueville has a couple of translations of his Democracy in America that are problematic and that were translated by people who had their own personal agendas and maybe didn't do the best job translating. You often see quotes of his from those translations that are problematic pop up in, for instance, the Hobby Lobby ads that you sometimes see on the 4th of July around the country. This to me is, but again, this is not a man who's a founding father. This is a man who's traveling around the United States 40 to 50 years after the founding as a foreigner, observing and then recording his own observations to take back to France. Right. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth. Like John Quincy Adams, like maybe not a primary source that we can point to prove the point that Johnson is working to prove here.
Now, one of the debates we're having in the culture right now is whether or not we're a Christian nation. Y'all heard that? The current occupant of the White House says we're not. I disagree. I mean, if you look at history, this is undeniable. We could do this all day. We could go through the founders' quotes and writings all day long. You probably know that. But you don't need to take my word for it, the fact that we at least began as a Christian nation, and don't even take these founders' words for it. Let's look at what a later U.S. Supreme Court determined on that very issue. In the next slide, I brought you an excerpt from this famous case called Church of the Holy Trinity versus the U.S. Now, this is 1892. The interesting thing about this case, why it was so historic, is because this is one of the legal issues in the case. The Supreme Court's task, the 9 justices, their actual task was to determine whether or not we're a Christian nation. So they take the occasion to review 87 volumes of historical records, a small library of records, going back to the Pilgrims era, to the founding of the first colonies, the writings of the founders, the original state constitutions, and all the rest. And this is what they conclude. This is historically true. From the discovery of this continent to the present hour, there's a single overall voice making this affirmation, that this is a Christian nation.
Yeah.
Andrew Seidel, as a constitutional attorney who has studied you've read every letter from every founder all through the formation of this country, and you know the back history that they refer to and all of that. Tell me, I'm thinking that whoever wrote this was a Christian themselves when they wrote that article, so of course they're going to say that.
It's a pretty good guess, Aaron.
Well, thank you.
That's a pretty good guess.
How do we address Johnson's claim that he's now saying that the U.S. Supreme Court has affirmed that the Supreme Court, not just the opinion of one justice in an obiter dictum or what have you, but he says that the U.S. Supreme Court has affirmed that the United States is a Christian nation, in direct contradiction to the Treaty of Tripoli and a number of other statements. How do you address Johnson's assertion here that America is a Christian nation?
Yeah, so this also comes from those Hobby Lobby July 4th ads. It's almost like he read one of those and that became his sermon here. And likely they're both stemming from the same source, which is David Barton, who's sort of the granddaddy of Christian nationalist disinformation. I have written about
he
this.
And I gave testimony in the same room at the same time.
Yeah, he is just done so much damage to this country's understanding of its own history. This is from an 1892 case that involved something called the Alien Contract Labor Law of 1885. Okay, so the court did not declare, in other words, it didn't hold. In fact, this language had nothing to do with the final holding in the case. So what we lawyers say that this is dicta, meaning that this is like an irrelevant side thought of the court. So
this
it didn't
declare the dictum.
Exactly. The court did not declare that this is a Christian nation. So that's point number one. The court instead, it ruled that the Alien Contract Labor Law didn't prevent churches from contracting to bring pastors from other countries to minister with their congregation. That's it. This is an issue of statutory interpretation. The opinion was written by Justice David Brewer, and Brewer does use those words, which shouldn't be surprising, as it did not surprise you, because Brewer was devoutly religious. He was the son of a Congregationalist minister. He was a former Sunday school teacher himself, right? And Brewer, I think, probably kind of regrets the language. So there's two paragraphs in here that is often cited. And Brewer goes back later in life and actually writes a book called The United States, a Christian Nation, referring to his Holy Trinity opinion in this case. And he asks and answers the question. He says, in what sense can the United States be called a Christian nation? And he answers it, this is the first sentence, not in any sense that Christianity is the established religion, or that the people are in any manner compelled to support it. On the contrary, the Constitution specifically provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Neither is it Christian in the sense that all Christians are either in fact or in name Christian. On the contrary, all religions have free scope within our borders. Numbers of people profess other religions, many reject all, right? Like, nor is it Christian in the sense that you have to be a Christian to hold public office, right? So he's basically like, all of that could be us. We could all be saying that. So in other words, we're not a Christian nation in any meaningful way. So what Brewer relies upon is our pre-constitutional, our colonial history. And when it comes to showing any of our actual government or laws being based on Christianity substantively, he kind of demurs. He says, I can show how largely our laws and our customs are based upon the laws of Moses, the teachings of Christ, how constantly the Bible is appealed to as a guide to life and as an authority in the question of morals, but I must not weary you, right? Like, and the pieces of evidence that he does trot out, like the oaths, the legislative prayer, Sabbath closing laws, that there are a lot of Christian churches all around the country, right? They don't point towards a nation based on Christian law or principles. They point to a nation made up of a lot of religious people. And nothing is mentioned by Brewer about the founding documents, the founding fathers, or the basis for our laws and government. I mean, he's not even talking about that, as he kind of concedes. So this, again, it's like a quote that they love, but if they actually took the time to look it up instead of just relying on David Barton or a Hobby Lobby ad, they would realize, oh, I don't know what I'm talking about.
Here's my concern. It's funny to me that we have somebody who's 77 years old complaining about someone who's 80 years old, 81 years old, about that the other guy's too old.
Yeah.
I find it a little bit alarming that we have seen for the last 4 years that we've seen Trump as a public figure in politics, that from the beginning of that, We've seen somebody who cannot complete a sentence intelligibly. We've seen somebody in very obvious cognitive decline since 2016, but his followers are saying that Biden is in cognitive decline. But what we actually do have, and Biden is actually able to form coherent thoughts with like reason behind them, which is something Trump has never demonstrated this in the entirety of his life.
That's true, but also Biden has had a lifelong stutter. So a lot of the times when you see him stumbling, he is combating that stutter that he had, from the first time he was able to talk. It's like, it's amazing sometimes what he has overcome, really. Anyway, sorry, just a side point that most people don't know about.
I'm a public speaker and I'm a confident lad, but if you put me on camera and I know that Fox News pundits are going to be trying to find any flaw with anything that I say, and I'm going to be measuring what I say very carefully. But my problem here is this: we do have a president who's 80, 81, and if there was an issue that looks like an accident, let's put it that way, and then Kamala Harris being not white, maybe she accidentally gets taken out by DC police for fitting the description, and now we have Johnson.
Yeah, this guy's 2 heartbeats away.
Yeah, and then we are a Christian nation.
I mean,
the United States, as the experiment that the founders meant to erect, is over.
I mean, I don't know that that's hyperbolic. I mean, I certainly, when Trump was desperately clinging to power, and I was watching January 6th unfold, and the role that Christian nationalism played.
How close we came.
I mean, so people like just seconds away here and there. I've watched so much of the video from that so that I could contribute to the January 6th and Christian nationalism report. Hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of video. And if they had put down their phones to stop filming themselves and instead concentrated fully, that day goes the other direction. Mike Pence, Mitt Romney, I mean, it goes completely other direction. So I mean, democracy is a struggle. It is not a guarantee, and we have to fight for it every single day. And everybody watching needs to ask what they are going to do over the next year to ensure that the next election, that our democracy can survive. Because with Mike Johnson this close, I am truly alarmed.
And I have to point out one other thing too: the people who identify as like the Constitutionalist Party, for example, and other people who profess to be all about the Constitution. The Constitution does not defend itself. And the greatest enemies the Constitution has are the people who claim to be constitutionalists, who have evidently not read or understood the Constitution. Because did you know that there's a First Amendment before that second one?
Well, and I'll just add, you're right, but I want to add one point, especially the lawyers, my fellow constitutional attorneys, people like Mike Johnson on the other side of this, right? Like look at the Georgia case against Trump, the effectively the RICO case. Like, it's lawyers, it's Jenna Ellis, it's Kenneth Chesbrough, however you say his name. It's the Kraken, right? And this is the same thing with Watergate, right? Like, it's always the lawyers. It's the people who understand the law and the Constitution enough to manipulate it and try to set it aside. Like John Eastman crafting this idea, this sham of a claim that we can set aside certifying the 2020 election, and using the law and the Constitution to try to justify that is appalling. So we need the people to stand up in overwhelming numbers, so we're not faced with something like that.
So in this divide where we've poisoned the well against leftist, because you can never say the word leftist on certain news channels without saying the word radical in front of it, as if there's no such thing as a leftist unless it's a radical leftist. I would say that the left generally preserves and protects human rights, while the right, to my experience, wants to minimize and repeal human rights. And this is where I see us going. So if we allow somebody who just a century ago we would have executed as a traitor, and he's still running free, running his golf course. He's still the leading nominee. And I feel, and I don't actually think that I'm being all that alarmist. As you said, you're not even sure that this is hyperbolic. I wish that it was.
Yeah. I mean, look, like Johnson's career has been dedicated to creating a Christian nation, and that includes and manifests as taking away the right of half the population to control their own bodies and reproductive freedom, and preventing LGBTQ people from having any measure of equality in our society at all. Right? That is what you are talking about, and that is what his goal is.
If I had dictatorial powers over this country, I tell you that my primary concerns would be whether your mother can still get her prescriptions that she needs. Whether people can go about their day-to-day lives and enjoy being alive, whether they still maintain the rights that they always had. And I see that my political opposition just wants superiority and dominion over everyone else.
I think that's accurate. Fight back, people.